Good morning. You obviously have not been raised right. Good morning. There you are. It's good to see you this morning. We have had an exciting couple of days, and unfortunately for us, this is our last morning to be together. But that will be a fantastic memory for us. In just a moment, Brother Dan Winkler will come and lead us in a study. I'd like to remind you of a couple of things, and we'll sing one song, and we'll give all the time that we can to Brother Winkler. Remember that there are a bunch of these little red bags that you need to take. And you say, well, I've already gotten one. That is excellent. Get another one, please. And there are a lot of these shirts. And you may say, I've already gotten one. And I would say to you, excellent. Get another one. There are a lot of these left. And so we need to distribute those throughout the 11 states that are represented here. And please get those, carry those throughout. Have a fond memory of being here and a fond memory of studying God's Word and a fond memory of Hot Springs, Arkansas, and anytime you find your way back through this area and it's a Sunday or a Wednesday or really for me or Michael any day of the week, come up here on top of the hill and see us. We'd love to see you. Let's stand and sing Wonderful, Merciful Savior, and then we'll turn our class over to Brother Winkler. Wonderful, merciful Savior. And oh, you rescue the souls of men. Almighty infinite Father, faithfully loving your own, here in your weakness you find us, falling before your throne. Oh, we're falling before your throne. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You are the in grace our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. Be seated, please.
Too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Majesty. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, for whom love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength. Note, if you would, from the words of Jesus, the preface of that command. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. This entire reading is actually called the Shema. And that because it comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and it begins with the word, a major part of their synagogue worship on a daily basis. To the extent that when it came to the little box that they would put on their door facings, and the little boxes that they would put on their arms and on their forehead, there would be little verses of the Bible in sections of those boxes. And one of the verses would be the Shema, the passage that we... And it begins by saying, you need to listen to this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. Nobody like Him. Note, if you would, secondly, the pronoun of Jesus' statement. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and you. Now, if you study that passage carefully, you will not see what we say in the South, y'all. It is not a plural pronoun. It is a singular pronoun. And so Jesus is saying, this is the greatest. This is the first in line of all other commandments. You as an individual person are to do something. Note, if you would, the precept of the command. Yes, precept means something that it has been designed as an edict, something that is a command. And Jesus was asked about the greatest of all commands. And so what He says is actually under the purview of that which is commanded by God. You as an individual agapao. It is the cognate verb for the noun, familiar to us, agape. This is this logical, this is this supreme love, which desires what is best for the one that is loved. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and you as an individual person shall desire what is best for the one that you love, God. And note, if you would, the periphery of Jesus, your God, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. Literally, the word that Jesus uses is not the word with, but it's the Greek preposition ek on each of those occasions. You shall love the Lord your God out of all of your heart, out of all of your soul, out of all of your mind, and out of all of your ability, literally, your strength. Every fiber of your being is to be wrapped up in, saturated with, you as a person wanting what is best for your God who is the only God. Jesus says that's the head of the line, first of all commandments in the Bible. Of course, He goes on to say in Matthew's account of Matthew 22, a second like this. That doesn't mean, okay, here's the first one and underneath that is the second one. No, that's not what Jesus said. He said, here's the first one and another one just like it. It stands side by side. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Hear me well. You cannot love God out of all of your heart, out of all of your soul, out of all of your mind, and out of all of your unless you love your fellow man. If you take those words in Mark chapter 12, put them into their contextual flow, you will find that Jesus is involved in a tit-for-tat dialogue with the extremist of His day. You had the alt-right Pharisees and scribes. You had the alt-left Sadducees. You had the culturally connected Herodians. And they are trying their best to trip Jesus up. And therefore the question comes, well, just what's the most important thing that we're to do? And Jesus says, you love God with all you are, and right alongside of that, you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the next time you mistreat your spouse, the next time you mistreat your neighbor, the next time you say something bad about the eldership, the next time you get in a fuss with a brother or sister in Jesus, realize it, you cannot love God unless you love your neighbor as yourself. These words serve as a foundation of the psalm that we have been assigned to study. I ask you to turn with me to Psalm 27. We will first of all look at the psalm and observe how it is introduced and how it is concluded. Having done so, we will then step back and watch how the psalm is dissected actually into two major thoughts. Having done so, we will dive into the psalm, read it carefully, and watch those thoughts unfold before us, and then close with a thought of application. Note, if you would, just by means of introduction, how Psalm 27 is introduced and how it concludes. Verse 1, the introduction. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? He says something similar later on in verse 3 when he says, though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. I will not fear. I will not be afraid. I will not fear. Psalm 27 begins with a note of courage. Watch, if you would, how Psalm 27 comes to a close with verse 14. Wait for the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Psalm 27 begins and concludes on the same note. It is a psalm about taking heart, taking courage because of God's involvement in your life. That being said, having seen the introduction and conclusion of the psalm, we suggest that the psalm could be divided into two major segments of thought. You have verses 2 through 7. After the psalm is introduced, the first major thought is protection from God. Then, after verse 7, there is a seismic shift in thought. In verses 8 through 13, right before the conclusion, you have a petition for God. And so the psalm divides itself in two ways: protection from God and then a petition for God, sandwiched between these two concepts of I will live my life with courage because of God's involvement in the same. With that outline before us, let's now read, beginning with verse 2 through verse 7, and focus on that first major set of thought: protection from God. In this reading, we're going to find 4 observations of interest used to flesh out this idea of the psalmist feeling confident because of his protection from God. As we read verses 2 through 7, I want you to pay particular attention to the repeated reference or references to antagonists in the life of the psalmist. And I want you to give special attention to how those antagonists are postured in reference to the psalmist. And it will further establish what he's saying about protection from God. Let's read. When evildoers, that's an antagonist. When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries, that's an antagonist, and foes, that's an antagonist. It is they who will stumble and fall. That, of course, because contextually, God's protection for the psalmist. Note, if you would, how the antagonists are postured against the psalmist. They assail me. Careful study will reveal that the word translated assail carries the idea of coming near. So here are the evildoers, the adversaries, and the foes, and they are encroaching upon. They are coming near to the psalmist. Picture, if you would, young David in the valley of Elah. And here on one side are Saul and all of his cowardice armies. On the other side, there are the Philistines, and they have all of their hopes set up in this gargantuan of a man, their champion, Goliath. And Goliath comes out of the crowd, and he begins to walk down the valley of Elah. And here's this young man, and he reaches down into that valley of Elah, that dried up riverbed, and he picks up 5 stones, and he puts one in his slingshot, and he begins to walk. And the evildoer, the adversary, the foe, begins to assail him. He begins to come near to him. And that's the concept that we find in verse 2. We keep reading, though an army encamp against me. There's the Philistine army. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise against me, yet I will be confident. You read 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and you will find that David was constantly at war with someone. He was at war for Saul's army. Remember, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Then when he became king, he turned this tribal confederacy that Saul was king over into a tremendous kingdom, a monarchy over which he was king, and he did so with God's help. And enemies were constantly at war with him. They're the antagonist, an army making war. But watch how the antagonists are postured. The army is against me. The war rises against me. Verse 4, one thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after Him, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in His temple. For He will hide me in His shelter in the day of trouble. Trouble, an antagonist, trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of His tent. He will lift me high upon the rock. Being concealed under the cover of God's tent with trouble abounding. The concept is trouble is over him, and he is under the tent of God's protection. Verse 6, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies, antagonists, all around me. And so you have evildoers, adversaries, and foes coming near to him. You have an army making war against him. You have trouble that is hovering over him. And you have his enemies all around him. But nonetheless, I will not fear. I will not be afraid. I will not fear. And that because in this first section of thought, he senses protection from God. Now, in this same reading, verses 2 through 6, we find these 4 observations to flesh out the idea of God protecting the psalmist. First of all, the psalmist writes about his confidence from God. Verses 2 and 3. Here are the evildoers, the adversaries, the foes assailing him. Here's the army, the war that's against him. Yet I will be confident. Confidence from God's involvement in his life. Second, in this reading, we have his sensing a presence with God. He said in verse 4, "One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after." If you had only one request that you could make before God, if He allowed you only one prayer to pray all of your life, and in that prayer you could make only one request and He would grant it, what would you ask? Health, happiness, long life, healthy marriage, healthy children, healthy marriages for your children, and health for your grandchildren? What would you ask? The psalmist said, "I have one thing that I would want to ask of God, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord." And the word translated dwell carries the idea of stay. I don't want to go visit with him. I don't just want to know his address. I want to go and I want to stay with my God. That's what I would request. Can I just come home and stay with you all the days of my life? He said, I want to go stay with God for a reason, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. I just want to go stay with God, and I want to go sit with God, would be another way to translate that word dwell. I just want to go sit with God, and I want to stare at Him. What does God look like? What does God look like? When you and I get to go to heaven, wouldn't it be wonderful if Jesus would walk across that crystal sea like He walked across the waters of Galilee and point in your direction, my direction, and say, "Come here." And then He reaches out those nail-pierced hands and He takes us by the hand, and we get to walk on the water of that crystal sea with Him. And we get to step into the very throne room of God and be in the very presence of the Almighty. What would that be like? What will He look like? Will the aura of His magnificence just penetrate and encapsulate the pores of my immortal, resurrected body? Will I be, because of His glory and essence, forced to my knees? The psalmist said, I just want to go sit down with God, and I want to stare at Him. I want to see what He's like. To gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in His temple. And another way to translate inquire is study. I want to go sit down with God, and I want to stare at God, and I would just like to have some study time with God. The psalmist senses a presence with God. Confidence from, presence with. This psalm continues to unfold, and he knows the benevolence of God. Verse 5, for He will hide me in His shelter. Here, under here, in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of His tent, just like Rahab hid and concealed the 12 spies on her roof of that brothel. God says, here, you come here, you come here. You hide over here from trouble. He will lift me high upon a rock. The benevolence of God. And because of all of this, next in verse 6 you have reverence for God. Listen to the praise. Now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. I will offer in His tent, where He's hidden me, sacrifices Sacrifices with shouts of joy. Take that to Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise. Literally, shout with joy unto the Lord. I will offer sacrifices with shouts of joy. I'm reading about worship. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Of course, reminding us of Ephesians 5, where we are to sing and make melody with the hearts to the Lord. Or Colossians 3, we are to sing and do so with grace in our hearts to the Lord. And so I'm reading about His extending reverence for God in a status of worship. So here is this first section, protection from God. And with all of that in mind, he fleshes this idea out by saying, I sense confidence from God. I sense my presence with God, or a desire for the same. I know the benevolence of God, and my heart overflows with reverence for God. Look at the connection between the psalmist and God. The psalmist is saying, you are beautiful beyond description. The psalmist is saying, I love you with all of my heart, with all of my soul, with all of my mind, and with all of my strength. And that because of God's involvement in his life. Question before we go farther. Is He involved in your life? Yes or no? Well, then how do you feel about Him? And how do you approach the difficulties of life? The second major section of the psalm, verses 7 through 13, before the conclusion, focuses on a petition for God. It shifts gears entirely, like many of the psalms. The psalmist begins to write about God, but then he is so overwhelmed by the thoughts, he has to start writing to God. This is what God is all about. Oh, God, I need to talk to you for a while. And that's what we find here. As we read verses 7 through 12, note the repeated use of one word. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help, cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on the level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries or false witnesses, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And then, of course, the conclusion, wait for the Lord, wait for the Lord. Of course, the word used repeatedly is the tetragrammaton. The word Lord spelled in all caps. And that because it translates Yahweh or Yahweh, the four consonants that constitute the covenant name for God, which God Himself interprets as, or translates as, I am. That is found 11 times in Psalm 27. Of the 11 times, 7 of them are in this last section, leaving only 4. And if you went back to the first section, 3 of the 4 remaining are in just one verse. The bulk of that word is found in the second section of Psalm 27, and it's the section where the psalmist is making petition to God. Quickly, 4 thoughts. He petitions God for his attention. He wants the attention of God. Verse 7 and 8. Hear, O Lord, answer me. Seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. I'm looking for you. I want you to look at me. Attention from God. Second, we read in verses 9 and 10, his connection with God, or a plea for the same. He says, don't turn your servant away in anger. Don't hide your face. Don't cast me off. Don't forsake me. My mama and my daddy had, but don't you do that. 5 or 6 times in 2 verses, he's saying, I want you in my life. I want a connection with you. So you have attention of God, connection with God, then instruction from God. Teach me your way. Verse 11 and verse 12. And then finally, the compassion that he sees in God when he references the goodness of God in verse 13. And so you have his petition to God. The protection from God, his petition to God, all within 2 verses that say, I'm just not going to be alarmed with life because God is in control of my life. We step back from that psalm with this closing thought of application. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. Proverbs 3 verse 5. You give your life to the care of God. Step back, get ready to be amazed. Then you can say with Isaiah, in Isaiah 12 verse 2, I will trust and not be afraid. For Yah, the Lord, is my salvation. He has become my strength and my song. Trust in the Lord, give your life to His care, and then you can echo the words of Jeremiah 17, verse 7. Happy is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope or trust the Lord is. A mama heard her little boy and her little girl playing church out on the steps of their modest little house. They were trying to mimic everything that they had heard and experienced the day before at worship. And so the little boy was standing in front of the little girl, and he was leading singing. And as they were singing together, they sang, Trust and Okay. For there's no other way to be happy. Yay. They missed the lyrics, didn't they? But they captured the sentiment. For when we learn to trust, truly trust God's involvement in our lives, we can echo the concepts of Psalm 27 and know it's going to be okay.
Outside it is a dreary, misty day. Inside we have the light of God's Word. We can study and understand and appreciate our God and the salvation and the trust and the protection He gives to us. What an excellent way to start our day. Thank you, Brother Winkler. I sure do appreciate it. We'll stand adjourned for a few moments, and then we will go to our next class. We'll have a few moments to stretch our legs and to enjoy our fellowship. And I'll be up here in just a few minutes. If you are a teenager, there is a teenagers class going on in 124, room 124 with Brother John DeBerry. There's also a ladies class going on in the multipurpose building with Sister Cindy Colley. And in here will be our Brother Eric Owens. Quickly, let me remind you of something you may or may not know, and we'll give all the time that we can to Brother Owens. PTP 365 is an online subscription that you can subscribe to as a church, and all your members, or a congregation, and all your members will have access, or as a family, those subscriptions are available. And it has all the lessons on MP3 and video for the past several years, and I think it actually goes all the way back to 2012, maybe further than that, I'm not sure. Those things will be available there, and all Spark videos and audios are available online for free. So you can enjoy those as you journey back home, and you can enjoy those throughout the year. With one pretty low subscription rate. Just go on there, type in PTP 365, and it'll tell you everything you need to know about that. In this hour, Brother Eric Owens will come and speak to us on some psalm between 1 and 150, and I can't remember which one it is right now, but he'll let us know when he gets up here.
Good morning. It's a delight to see you this morning. I don't envy the job of host. That's a tough job to stand up after every session, introduce every session, be here for every session. Doing a great job, but remembering Psalm 51 was apparently a challenge this morning. We take relationships seriously, and the more intimate the relationship, the more seriously we take it. The greater investment we have in it, and the more desirous we are to see it succeed. And so imagine a relationship, maybe between a spouse or even a parent to a child, where one person has done something wrong. They have transgressed against the other person. And the one who received the wrong has forgiven. They have assured the offender that all is well and that they go on with their lives and move forward. However, the one who did the wrong constantly brings it up again. And they relive it over and over and over again, and they come back to the person who has offered the forgiveness and reminds them again and questions the forgiveness, not because the person who has forgiven brings it up again, but because the offender can't seem to get past it. And so time elapses, but then they come back and they ask again, did you forgive me? They bring back up the infraction because I did this and this and this and this and this, and I know you said it, but I just want to be sure. What would that do to the relationship? How would that affect the one who offered the forgiveness? What would that do to the one who can't seem to get past and accept the forgiveness? That's kind of the topic and setting that we have before us this morning. Psalm 51 is full of powerful pleas from a penitent child of God. Now, actually, our topic title, which I'll tell you in just a second, I don't think is actually David's problem per se, although he may struggle with it a little by some of the things that he says. David is a faithful, righteous man, and I believe that David understood God and ultimately his forgiveness. But what we hear in this psalm are some pleas directly for mercy. You read the psalm, there is no pretense. Guilty is the verdict, and it's understood by both parties. The guilty goes to the courthouse of heaven. He ascends the stairs, enters the hall of justice, makes his way to the bench, and falls down before the judge of all the earth prostrate and pleads for mercy. Our title is What God Forgets That We Remember. Sometimes when you get titles, and topics, you kind of just scratch your head, and it takes you a while, at least it does me. What were they thinking when they said that? The thing begins with what God forgets. Now, God is infinite in knowledge. And so it took a while to come up with something that the God of heaven would forget. The conclusion was maybe the only thing that's being asked for in the psalm. What God forgets is our sin. And if we're rating sin, and if it's proper, and I don't know that it is to rate and rank them as this and that, David did some egregious things against the God of heaven. What are some things that God forgets that we remember? Well, number one would be God forgets because God forgives. Let's establish that first. God forgives our failings. Verse number 1, David says, "Be gracious to me,